While we'd all love to have the latest and greatest CPU on the market, that's not always the case, and with some pretty affordable models from both AMD and Intel now on the market, it's time for a good old-fashioned head-to-head between the Ryzen 5 7600 non-X and the Core i5 13400F. But before we get into that, here's a quick word from this video sponsor.
I'm never going to be an esports gamer. I never get any kills.
I wouldn't be so sure of that.
Is that Andy Raffel from eTeknix.com?
Yes, my son. It is me, Andy Raffel from eTeknix.com.
What are you doing here?
I'm here to bestow upon you a gift that will transform you into a true gamer. With a 24.5-inch Full HD screen, 240Hz refresh rate, 0.5 millisecond response time, AMD FreeSync Premium, and height adjustability, you'll be gaming in the big leagues in no time.
Oh, thank you.
No problem, my son. Why don't you check out the link in the description below to find out more.
So if you're looking for a somewhat mid-range CPU for the purposes of gaming, you have a few choices, especially when looking around the $200 or so mark. You could go with AMD and the Ryzen 5 7600 with its 6 cores, 12 threads and max boost clock of 5.1 GHz, or Intel and their Core i5 13400F with its 4 efficiency cores and 6 multi-threaded performance cores, giving you a total of 16 threads with a max turbo speed of 4.6 GHz. So basically a slightly slower but very similar CPU to the i5 12600K from last generation, though you would argue this is a little bit more affordable. Now, whatever the choice, you're going to be faced with a choice of 65-watt parts that should be man enough for anyone wanting to play the latest titles out there, depending on the rest of their system. And of course, their all-important GPU. Now, while the Intel CPU does have the slight upper hand of being able to run on both DDR4 and DDR5 based systems, while AMD is kind of reserved purely for the newer platform. So on paper, it's anyone's guess as to who will win. Though I think it's safe to say that anyone who has been following along intently at Intel and AMD performance over the last kind of couple of generations will likely know which way this should head before we even jump into our benchmarks. Now, as always, we will be focusing purely on gaming performance in this head-to-head, and we've tested both CPUs at all three major resolutions, so 1080p, 1440p and even 4K. Though when looking at anything relating to CPUs, 1080p is always the main resolution to look at, as it takes the GPU bottleneck out of the equation, at least more so than in higher resolutions. Now, we've tested the CPUs in a total of 15 games to give kind of a good idea as to how each CPU performs across a wide range of titles, and we will be looking at the overall averages across each resolution, and of course cost per frame to give you kind of a better idea as to what processor really gives the better bang for buck, especially as they are priced so closely to each other. To test our CPUs, we keep the test systems as close to each other as possible for the fairest test, because obviously one is AMD and the other is Intel. Now for this, both of our test systems use the exact same memory, which was G-Skill Trident Z Neo clocked at 6000 MHz, and the same GPU, which is an Inno3D RTX 4090 iChill X3, again to eliminate any GPU bottleneck that would normally present itself. For the motherboards, we used an Asus ROG Maximus Z790 Extreme for Intel testing, and the Gigabyte X670E Aorus Master for our AMD testing. For all of our testing, we ran each system on the latest respective BIOS with the NVIDIA 527.37 driver for our RTX 4090, and everything was run on Windows 11 21H2, as we've currently not had a chance to update our testing data to a newer version since AMD used to run, well, frankly terribly on newer versions. But it will be something we will update in the near future. Also, if you appreciate the mass amounts of hard work that we put into these videos and all of the testing, then you can support us over on Patreon, where you'll get access to a ton of exclusive benefits along with all of the charts from our testing, and the link for all that is down below. So with that out of the way, let's take a look at those glorious benchmarks. Starting off with Assassin's Creed Valhalla, and at 1080p, the Ryzen 7600 gets off to a good start, coming in with 23% more performance over the 13400F. As we move up to 1440p, we see a smaller difference of 11% between the two, again in favour of AMD, while at 4K the average frame rate sits with an unnoticeable 1% difference, though still in favour of AMD. Next up is Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, and here we saw the same story, with the 7600 outperforming the 13400F at all resolutions. At 1080p, the Ryzen comes in 16% faster over the Intel chip, while at 1440p we saw a smaller difference of just 9%, whilst 4K again drew ever closer with only a 2% difference, which in reality would be barely noticeable when we're looking at frame rates well over 100 frames per second. CSGO ended up with the biggest difference in performance from all the games we looked at, with a 28% variance between the 925 FPS we got from AMD and the 661 FPS from Intel. 1440p was a similar story, with the 7600 coming in 26% faster than the Intel CPU, while again the frame rates at 4K had the two processors much closer in performance, with a difference of just 8%. In Cyberpunk, the results sat much closer, with just a 5% difference in performance at both 1080p and 1440p, while 4K sees a huge dip with just a single frame difference between the two chips. But with this one being one of the most graphically intensive games that we test, this is somewhat expected as the CPU starts to take a back seat to the GPU here, especially at higher resolutions. In Death Stranding, we see similar findings as we did in Cyberpunk, with 1080p and 1440p displaying very similar results with just an 11% difference between the two CPUs, while at 4K the difference narrowed down to just 3% again, in favour of AMD. Dirt 5 is next, and at 1080p we see a strong 19% performance gain in favour of the Ryzen 5 processor, putting it around 40 FPS ahead of the Core i5, while at 1440p that gain shrinks but still sits comfortably 9% ahead of what Intel have to offer. 4K narrowed the gap once more, now with the Ryzen CPU sitting with just 4% more frames per second than Intel, and it kind of leaves me with the thought of, can Intel even claw anything back at this point? Moving on to Dying Light 2, and at 1080p the Ryzen CPU again comes out on top with 14% more performance than the Core i5, while at 1440p it was mostly the same story, with the Ryzen chip performing 13% better than the Intel equivalent. Then, just like we've seen in other titles, 4K takes a huge performance hit for both CPUs as the GPU starts to do more work, here with a performance lead to AMD of around 6%. F122 was a bit weird. Whilst the 7600 did still stay on top throughout all three resolutions, the difference actually got larger as the resolution went up. 1080p was the smallest difference in frame rate, with only 3% between the two CPUs in favour of AMD, while moving up to 1440p we see a larger difference between the two of around 5%, which is already strange enough without 4K taking an even bigger jump with 7% more frames per second, again in favour of AMD. Far Cry 6 sees a clear CPU bottleneck as between 1080p and 1440p, each of the results only drop by a single frame per second between the two resolutions, meaning that the performance difference actually stayed the same for both at around 24%, again, you guessed it, in favour of AMD. 4K saw the CPU's performance difference narrowing down to about 11%, but with an interesting twist, as almost all of the performance lost was from the Ryzen 5 7600, though it still managed to sit ahead of its Intel competitor. Next up is Forza Horizon 5, and we saw some pretty strange anomalies. At 1080p there was a 20% difference in FPS in favour of AMD, with the 7600 sitting at a solid 250 FPS, whilst the 13400F sat at a smaller but still respectable 199 FPS. From there, both CPUs actually gained performance, increasing by around 2 to 3 frames per second due to how powerful the RTX 4090 is that we tested with. 4K was the most interesting as the performance difference between the two CPUs decreased to 14%, but upon looking closer, while the AMD results did change between the resolutions, the Intel chip barely changed throughout, which makes it seem that the GPU is bottlenecked by the Intel CPU throughout this entire game. Horizon Zero Dawn was next on the list, and for the first time, Intel was on top in terms of performance, with a solid 15% higher FPS at 1080p, decreasing to around 11% at 1440p, and then with just a 1% difference at 4K, though again in favour of Intel. Spider-Man Remastered was up next, and we're back to AMD dominating, with the Core i5 13400F sitting with 26% worse performance than the Ryzen 5 7600 at 1080p and 22% lower at 1440p, with 4K taking an expected extra dip, though still sees AMD coming out 11% faster. Flight Sim has always been a weird game to test, as the CPU bottleneck is so extreme that it can feel somewhat unpredictable. Now at 1080p we saw a 22% difference in performance in favour of Team Red, while at 1440p we saw the Intel CPU with the same FPS as 1080p, while the Ryzen CPU actually gained 7 FPS on average, increasing the difference up to 27% between the chips. Both CPUs saw a drop in 4K, albeit minor, with the difference now down to about 19%. In Red Dead Redemption 2, again, it seems that the 13400F is bottlenecking the system, as the FPS barely changed between 1080 and 1440p, whilst the performance of the 7600 dropped quite dramatically between the resolutions, meaning that the performance difference of 16% at 1080p drops down to just 5% of 1440p, though still in favour of AMD. 4K once again significantly sees a drop in performance on both CPUs, also widening the gap in performance up to 14% as the drop hits Intel particularly hard. Lastly, in Watch Dogs Legion, we see performance on both CPUs dropping through the resolutions, with the AMD CPU coming in 13% faster at 1080p, 9% faster at 1440p, and 8% faster at 4K. So a pretty clear-cut story for this head-to-head, with AMD coming out on top in all but one game. Though to get a better indication as to what that means across all games, it is worth taking a look at the overall average performance for each resolution to give us a basic idea of where the performance lies in general for the two CPUs. The overall averages really do tell the whole story for this comparison. At 1080p, AMD comfortably sit 20% ahead of the Core i5-13400F, while at 1440p, it still demands a strong 17% lead, again in favour of AMD. Then, naturally, as you'd expect, the gap shrinks quite dramatically to just 6%, with AMD being the victor. But at 4K, you're expecting less of the CPU and more of the GPU, and it's clear to see that bottleneck is an issue on both of these CPUs at varying resolutions, especially with the Intel just reaching some kind of ceiling that it just simply can't get past. Now, what was interesting is how strong the 1% lows were on the AMD CPU, especially at 1440p, showing that maybe that's the sweet spot that, it could have there before, performance falls off at the higher 4K resolutions, which is pretty evident considering how close both CPUs were at 4K in both the averages and the 1% lows. So as I said, pretty clear cut, and to get a better idea as to what that actually means for your wallet and obviously value for money, it's worth looking at the cost per frame. And in the US at 1080p, the Intel CPU will demand a premium of around 10% more when looking from a pure gaming perspective. At 1440p, that gap does narrow down to about 8%, still showing more favourable value for what AMD have produced in comparison to Intel across the 15 games we tested, though there are some outliers like Microsoft Flight Sim, and I invite you to do your own sums in the games that you play to kind of work out what's right for you. Then when going up to 4K, where the CPU is, completely tapped out, we see both processors fall within just 2% of each other when looking at the cost per frame. Though I think it's safe to say that I wouldn't expect anyone to buy an i5-13400F with an RTX 4090 and then to game at 4K. But for the sake of comparison, there's still something to take away from it. Now in the UK, the gap at 1080p shrinks slightly, with the Intel processor now demanding 9% more in terms of cost per frame, coming in just over £1 per frame, while the Ryzen 5 sits at 93 pence per frame. Then at 1440p, the gap narrows slightly, with Intel's Core i5 coming in 7% more expensive than Ryzen 5, though still both coming in at a pretty reasonable price, which is a little over £200. Then at 4K, much like in the US, the difference drops it to around 2%, but this time with Intel coming out as the better buy in terms of cost per frame, though there is a little more to it than that, as the Intel CPU still has that option of having a DDR4 based system compared to AM5, which gives no choice other than DDR5, which is still currently a lot more expensive in comparison. Now, not only that, but the boards on Intel do also tend to come in, I guess, a little bit cheaper. So when comparing the price of a complete system, you'll likely find that there really isn't much between them. And if anything, the Intel system may actually end up coming out slightly cheaper overall. Though with prices changing daily and not having directly comparable boards across both platforms and chipsets, it does kind of throw a few more variables into the mix. Now, the other key thing to think about is Intel's platform and kind of what it actually means for longevity. As we know, Z790 or B760 isn't going to be around forever, while AM5 has already been firmly announced as being around for quite some time into the future. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that could make your buying decision even more kind of hectic, especially if you have other reasons for buying your system other than just looking at value for money, because it could then be argued that longevity accounts for value for money as well, and sometimes more so than what actually, the performance that you get from each processor is like. For me, I think it's clear to see that AMD have this one sewn up, and Intel would have to drop pricing on the 13400F to kind of make it a bit more of a viable option when looking at the cost to performance ratio, along with giving consumers a reason to buy it, considering the platform that it's on, well, isn't really going to be around for as long as AMD's offering. Now, what is clear to see is that no matter what CPU, you're unlikely to be pairing it with an RTX 4090 like we did. And it's clear to see that performance is up for grabs that can utilize the CPU without the fear of bottleneck, especially at the lower resolutions. So with that, both CPUs would suit a 1080p or even 1440p gamer on a budget. But as mentioned, there's a few more choices to make first in terms of the platform and how long you want it to last you. So yeah, good luck with making that decision, because it's still a very, very tough one for many different reasons. And on that tough decision, that about wraps it up for this video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, then a like and a sub to the channel would be amazing. And if you love what we do and want to see all of our chart data, as well as exclusive behind the scenes content, bi-weekly game nights, and much, much more, then feel free to support us over on Patreon. The link for all that good stuff is down below. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys. Bye-bye.